On the internet, dedicated skeptics who investigate these vicious crimes are members of an elite squad known as the Special Snowflake Unit. These are their stories.
And audio. Just so needy.
All right, we are live, and I will do those things for you.
All right, thank you. Welcome back, Wolfpack. Direwolf here for another Dire Discussions. And of course, I have my co-host with me, Fox. How you doing, buddy?
Pretty good. How are you doing tonight?
Doing fantastic. Today was a good day and overall a good week, but not a good week for the New York Times, which is the subject of today's Dire Discussions. I want to thank everyone who is watching and supporting our channel. We appreciate every last one of you. If you want to help this channel grow, please share out the channel to your social medias.
All of them.
And all of them. All the social medias. And also a reminder before we get into our topic that for every $2 donated or every, 200 points, Lino points donated, you get an entry into our raffles. And we have two raffles right now. We have one ergonomic booby mouse pad, and we have Dreamkeeper's comic. For Dreamkeeper's comic, the link is below on YouTube. It is not linked below on DLive right now because I suck and I'm still changing over the links below.
And
we also have
counting on you.
We have a lemon already from Tetris Freak. Thank you very much for that lemon, and much appreciated. So, this New York Times. I mean, there's a lot to say about the New York Times. They have some really bad articles that came out this week, but we're just going to be addressing one of them. It's pretty bad. It's worth discussing for an hour about just this one topic. But God, if we were just go into what they published this week, we could be here all night. But we'll deal with more of that tomorrow.
Yes. We got a big story lined up for the New York Times tomorrow. They're doing a lot of journalism, a lot of newsing. I think that's how you pronounce it, is newsing. That's what they do.
Aruka, I'm sorry. But you know what? You do help us out a lot, and I'm sure we'll be able to make it up to you in other ways. In any case, let's get into this story. What are we talking about here?
We are talking about the hypocrisy of the New York Times. The New York Times is having a bad week this week. It started out with one of their editors, Tom Wright Persicini, I guess I'm a racist for not being able to pronounce that right, who was outed by Breitbart for making anti-Semitic and anti-Native American comments on Twitter back in 2010. And I can almost guarantee you that those anti-Native American contents contain more than 1/128th anti-Native American sentiment in them. This was followed not much later by the New York Times publishing an article complaining that, quote, a loose network of conservative operatives allied with the White House, of all places, had searched through social media histories of journalists, editors, and contributors to the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post. They reportedly found and archived racist and bigoted statements from 100 of their employees.
Yes, 100 of their employees. But I want to point out, by the way, when they say that they are allied with the White House, they're allied with the White House and Trump in the same way that these networks are allied with Biden or Hillary. They're supporters of. They're conservatives who believe that Trump is a better president. And they're trying to say, oh, this is somehow linked to Trump. No, it's conservatives saying, hey, you guys are always attacking conservative commentators and journalists and going and trying to find something in their past to destroy them in the now. Well, how about some of your own medicine, right? So that's right. They didn't complain about the fact that their employees, 100 of them, and their colleagues had said sexist, racist, and anti-Semitic things. No. They complained that conservatives had simply recorded their public statements with the intent to expose them for the bigots that they are. Priorities.
How could you? How dare you?
This is your guys' fault that we said those things.
So what they did, which is what they did, the Conservative Opposition Research Group has already released several embarrassing and bigoted comments that were posted by journalists from WashPo, CNN, and New York Times. According to one of the group's leaders, conservative consultant Arthur Schwartz, this first release is just the beginning. After the first release, he said on Twitter, they plan to expose more of the New York Times bigots.
They said that your volume is a little low.
I'm sorry.
Only a fraction of what the network claims to have uncovered has been made public. The remaining of the evidence they are planning to release at opportune times throughout the remaining of the 2020 election cycle. Something for us to look forward to, I guess. Journalists at those networks have already gone back and started deleting old comments, so they likely already know or have an idea what these conservative groups have on them. And all they have to do is wait, dreading the day coming soon when it is their turn to be exposed.
The New York Times, wait a second, sorry. The New York Times was very worried. Their article in response to the release verified that some of the material already released was authentic, but that in some cases it was stripped of context or presented in misleading ways, which much of it has been professionally harmful to its targets.
The operative phrase is, or was, in some cases, showing that they admit that their journalists, in many cases, really did say those bigoted things.
Oh, that's rough.
Glossing over that fact. However, their complaint that in some cases that the comments were stripped of context and were misleading is pretty rich, coming from the news organization that does that on a regular basis. That's their bread and butter.
I'm really surprised that they know what context means.
Yeah, they demonize the Covington kids as racist by posting a video of them out of context and publish straight out lies about them. Not just misleading. They were straight out lies.
Yeah, you didn't really need context to see what the kid had a MAGA hat on. He was probably going to KKK rallies all the time.
How dare they say there's a problem with their comments being taken out of a context or being used in a misleading way when that is what they do?
Almost like it's their job.
Yeah.
The New York Times went on to complain in their article that the statements that were released... oh, wait. Did I already read that? Oh, wait. Yeah. That statements that were already released were professionally harmful to its targets. It is massively hypocritical for the New York Times of all organizations to complain about anybody using social media posts to harm someone's career. Must I remind you that the New York Times reported on Justine Sacco and helped get her fired over a single tweet.
Yeah, just one tweet was enough reason to ruin her entire life. But, all the tweets of these 100 journalists. By the way, not just one tweet each. Lots of tweets. They have a history of bigotry. All of them, they don't deserve the same treatment that they dish out to other people. Pretty hypocritical. The left-wing media does this on a regular basis. Not just New York Times. Not just picking on the hypocritical nature of New York Times. They're the ones that wrote the article that was hypocritical. But the left-wing media in general does this on a regular basis. But the Times said in their article that when they criticize Trump, it's journalism speaking truth to power. But when conservatives criticize them, it's oppressing the media. What do they see? What they don't seem to realize is that journalists are also public figures, just like politicians, and they're not immune to criticism. They also attack conservative journalists all the time. They criticize comments from the likes of Bill O'Reilly and Tucker Carlson. So if they aren't immune, neither are the journalists on the left.
I seem to remember poor Tucker getting called out for a almost 10-year-old spot on a comedy show called Bubba the Love Sponge, and I'm almost positive the New York Times reported on it, but because everybody was reporting on it at the time, but they were ripping Tucker apart for something he said on a show called Bubba the Love Sponge, as if that, him talking on that show was his de facto policy position for his whole life. That's the place that he said it at, not his years on cable on his own show, but his 5 minutes call-in segment on Bubba the Love Sponge was the end all of his opinion on, I don't even remember what the topic was. I'm sure it was something quote unquote racist, but they ripped him up and down for that.
Right. And honestly, if you're trying to criticize someone's reporting or opinions now, there is absolutely no value in criticizing their opinions now, and going back 10 years ago and taking something they said a long time ago. They may not even believe those things anymore, right? And if you're just discounting all the things they may have said since then, so in some cases, there's one actual Democrat who was being maligned as being anti-gay marriage, and they used a quote from. So this is with the left eating the left, right? They used a quote from 10 years ago when he had made anti-gay marriage comments. But then for the last 6 years, he'd been an advocate for it, right? So what's more important, his opinions and his arguments now and for the last 6 years, or something he said a long time ago before his opinion changed?
That's an interesting standard, because I believe Obama and Hillary and Clinton and all the other ones, they all had very strong opinions against gay marriage up until they didn't, and then they changed their policy position.
Exactly. That's a lot of Democrats change their opinions on it. But the left-wing hate mob's outrage is very selective and very tribalistic.
Are you sure?
I mean, I'm just suspecting. There's a mountain of evidence, I mean, that I could refer to, but still guessing.
Yeah. The real hypocrisy is that the mainstream media, the New York Times included, have used their vast resources and influence as media companies to go after private persons in the exact same way that people are going after them. CNN, for instance, hunted down and exposed a person who simply retweeted a Russian bot, and they blackmailed the person who created the CNN Trump WWE meme. They have also threatened and doxed private people for nothing more than tweets and Facebook posts. Comes to mind is that poor black forklift driver a few months ago who they ripped up and down for, I don't even remember what he did, but he is also tweet related. They hunted him down and found out that he was a little poor forklift driver. They hunted down some old lady who was probably in her 50s or 60s and went to her house and brought news crews to her house at early time in the morning to ask her questions about her social media posts. And also recently was Kyle Kashuv, who they in general, I think it was CNN who found it, but again, all the various left-wing media organizations were all reporting on it. They found some stuff that Kyle had said in a Google Doc from years ago, and they decided that was international newsworthy to report on what a 15-year-old kid had said in a Google Doc once.
Right. So those 4 examples right there. A kid who got attacked by the media for a Google Doc, a guy who got blackmailed for the WWE Trump meme, CNN meme, the guy who got so the woman who retweeted a Russian bot, the forklift driver who just simply tweeted out something that Trump liked, right? All these people have zero power. They were just average individuals, Joe Schmoes. They had no power and influence. But it was totally fine for the mainstream media to go and, shame them publicly to a international audience, right? That was fine. But then it's wrong for conservatives, some of which are also public figures, to go and take the same method, same tactic, go and look into the information of the journalists, their social media, and say, hey, you're just as bad or far worse than the people you're trying to destroy.
Yes, Dyer, I think you've captured what their intention was. Yes, it is okay for them to do it. It's not okay for you to do it to them. Case closed.
Rules for thee and not for me, right?
Well, they're up in that high castle. It's hard looking down on all us peasants,
It's pretty fucking elitist, isn't it?
Well, one might call it that.
One might call it elitist. They believe that it's their responsibility to influence and tell people what to think, and they just don't like when the magnifying glass is turned around on them. Too fucking bad. This is the culture. This is the cancel culture you helped develop and create, and now it's being used against you. You created a monster. There's no controlling the regressive leftist hate mob. It attacks everyone because no one, according to intersectionality, is pure. Everyone's an oppressor in some way. Good job. Created a monster that will turn around and kill you.
It's almost like that's happened every single time anybody with a left idea gets power and implements it. That happens with governments all throughout history. Pretty much every left-wing organization ends up eating itself. We're seeing that with all the various intersectionality cults, and now the left-wing media. They're getting the tape. They set all these new standards for how to oppress people, and all of a sudden they're really confused when the tables get turned on them.
Yeah, we might as well start calling the New York Times Dr. Frankenstein.
They'll wish that they got it that good.
Yeah, right. Anyways, let's move on to the story.
All right, this New York Times article was so ridiculous and hypocritical that it was mocked by the left wing and right wing sources.
Wait, did I skip my section?
You
Yeah,
started on it, and then
okay.
you derailed from it, so I just figured we'd skip it.
Okay, so New York Times crying about the journalists being held accountable. I didn't read that. The New York Times is crying about the journalists being held accountable for their own words like they do to everyone else. It's ridiculous for them to do that. They call it media suppression when they are being held accountable, but it's journalism when they do it. The New York Times has previously praised Media Matters and an organization whose sole purpose is to create opposition research into conservatives, including conservative journalists, for the purpose of getting them fired. But instead of calling it oppression of journalism, they call it scrutiny of public statements. Times reporter Kenneth P. Vogel and Jeremy W. Peters wrote in an article for the New York Times last year that the liberal group Media Matters for America helped pioneer close scrutiny of public statements by conservative media personalities. They praised the idea of journalists, scrutinizing public statements by conservatives. They praised that tactic. But then now that it's being used against them, it's a bad tactic.
Well, of course.
Hey, sorry, New York Times. These conservative people who are, or this network, this conservative network, is just scrutinizing the public statements of your journalists. They're doing the same thing you praised Media Matters for America doing.
But they don't like.
They didn't invent the tactic. They're just using the tactic you started off with. How do you like it?
Well, isn't that part of the First Amendment that there's press freedom and they've got the freedom from scrutiny? Is that in the First Amendment or is it not?
No, actually, no, it's not.
Oh wow, okay, wow, crazy.
Just because you become a journalist means you report on things, hopefully objectively. It doesn't mean that you're now free from scrutiny for everything you've said. How horrible would that be? Like, oh, I'm gonna tell the world what you say, but you can't tell the world what I say. You can't embarrass me.
It all sounds like propaganda, not journalism.
It's a ridiculous, untenable standard to set, and it just makes them sound really, really scared, and they're just grasping at straws because they know at least 100 employees on the left that are working for mainstream media have done some pretty shitty stuff, and it's going to further destroy the credibility of the organizations.
And it's not really like we don't all know that the New York Times in particular has a really, really devastating problem with anti-Semitism. Multiple times just this summer that they've had, very vividly, obviously anti-Semitic cartoons and editorials on their front page. I can't imagine, and they already have one of their editors going down for anti-Semitic. I don't know if you guys saw the tweets, which we can't even really read them on YouTube because they're that bad. We'll get kicked off for sure. But the tweets were pretty horrendous. What he was saying about Jews already, and I just can't imagine what the rest of these other 100 employees are going to be saying, and I'm guessing it's going to have a lot to do with anti-Semitism.
In the case of that one editor at the very beginning of the story, the one Tom Wright, he claimed, "Oh, in context, I was just joking. I was saying those things satirically." Yeah, like you guys have ever cared in the past about context. Like you have ever, be able to accept things as being a joke, being offensive comedy. No, they always take things as uncharitably as possible and with no humor. So if that's a standard you're going to apply to everyone else, then that's a standard that they're going to apply to you.
Exactly. That goes into kind of the ridiculousness of their claim and the ridiculousness and hypocriticality of this article. It was so bad that it was mocked by right and left-wing sources alike. Politico pointed out that the New York Times was presenting a journalistic double standard, obviously. Politico's Jake Schaefer wrote, "As much as I would like to sympathize with my fellow journalists, it doesn't strike me as unreasonable to ask them to own or repudiate vile or impolite things they may have stated in the past. Yeah, take responsibility for what you said." They're always asking people to own what they said, even to the point of disavowing it multiple times, dozens, hundreds of times live on air, and they still want you to take. I need you to condemn and disavow this statement over and over and over again. And, we bring up a screenshot of one of their tweets, and they're like, "How dare you? How dare you? How dare you?"
Funny. The word was impolitic, which is to not be political. I know you read it and you're like, is that really a word? He must have meant impolite.
Well, I'm not as smart as a journalist. I only know how to code.
Right. He did seem to use needlessly large and less common words in the article. I think he might think he's intelligent.
He's very smart.
He must be smart.
Absolutely.
But you have fucked up bad. New York Times when even the Politico is calling you out. And I'm not saying Politico's just one of many left-wing outlets that New York Times, you're whining about what we all do.
You're giving away the game, man. Don't do it.
Yeah, it's called opposition research. If it's bad for them to do it, then we're the bad guys too. Because for God's sake, they just what was the Russian dossier? The Trump Russian dossier.
I think that was newsworthy, wasn't it?
It was also opposition research that was put forth by all these left-wing outlets with zero, scrutiny, right?
Exactly.
The left-wing media sources, the left-wing media sources being called out for their bigotry or their bigoted employees is just their own cancel culture supporting hens coming back to roost. We at Direwolf Media don't think that a person's opinion 10 years ago necessarily reflects their opinions now. We don't think that it is meaningful or constructive criticism to drag up old tweets to criticize a person's ideas in the now and in the today. Some of these journalists were very young, and some of them may not have even been journalists when they made these comments. There should be room for forgiveness for people who change. We should be criticizing what they say and advocate for today. All that said, those are my principles. These left-wing journalists are just now being held to the same standard they've been holding everyone else to. So it seems pretty damn fair.
Well, and there's a little bit of an aspect of fight fire with fire, right? So the unfortunately, this might not be the best way to phrase it. I'm sure there's a better way to phrase it, but it's what's in my head right now, and I'm sure in 10 years from now, somebody will pull it up to soundbite, and I'll regret it. But having the moral standard of never holding your enemy to the same standard that they hold you to, that can sometimes be very costly. So if their side's always allowed to use that rule of we're going to go back and dig for your history as much as possible and then use it against you, but our side never does that to them, then we keep having guys on our side, journalists on our side, and commentators getting picked off over and over again, and through attrition, we'll just end up running out of people. I mean, the last hit on Tucker was pretty rough. He's still shaken from that. But if they're allowed to just do that, and then they're not going to suffer any repercussions when their history is, as I'm sure that these tweets are going to be showing, far, far worse, far more egregious, and just from a quote-unquote moral stance, we would never do that to them and hold them to their own standard, then they just get to sit there and keep doing it while our side gets picked off. And so that's kind of the high cost to that moral principle there. Not that it's a bad moral principle. It's obviously it's a good one. It's a moral principle to have. But that's just kind of my thought on it, is that it's there's a high cost to holding that principle.
So the principle I described there about how you gotta make allowance for people to change, that is the morally right thing. However, sometimes you need to take the enemy's tactic and show them why it's bad, right?
Yeah.
So they may not, if you use that dishonest tactic back at them and say, hey, this is what's going to happen. If this is the standard you want to set, then we're going to use it back at you. They'll quickly realize, oh, okay, so that's far worse for us. We'll stop doing that. The moral standard's far better. In any case, it's kind of like I think it's like a back during like Civil War era tactics before, not Civil War. It was Revolutionary War tactics. It was deemed as being bad to shoot at commanders, because over in the posh military style conflict over in Europe, they had these gentlemen agreements to not shoot at commanders because they didn't like the tactic being used against them.
Well,
they
made it dying's for the grunts.
Right? Yeah, dying's for the grunts. And all the leaders, the generals and lieutenants and such, were all like aristocrats. So they had these ridiculous agreements between warring armies to not shoot at the leaders because they didn't like the tactic being used against them.
That's very polite of them.
I know, it's such a polite warfare. It didn't last. It didn't do very well against the Americans, though. We totally did not follow their rules.
Well, that's because we're the rebels, and down with the queen. Well, I guess it was a king back then. A more contemporary example of that, though, is the mass shootings. So when we had a Bernie bro going after Congress, a group of Republican Congress people, we made very sure to not ascribe that as Bernie's responsibility, as something to him, even though the left always ascribes motive back to the right. More recently than the Congress shooting was a what was that, 3-4 weeks ago? The Dayton and El Paso weekend, which was horribly tragic. But we had the El Paso shooter who, for some reason, after ascribing a radical environmentalist agenda in his manifesto, was somehow linked to Trump. I still am trying to figure that one out. And the media was continuous, and that this was Trump's fault. This was Trump's killer. He did this for Trump at the direction of Trump's subliminal messages that he's sending out through TV by putting up the flag on 8/8. They went over that over and over and over again. Yet the same weekend, within the same 12-hour block of time, we had the Dayton shooter who was a supporter of Elizabeth Warren. And they never said anything about that. That was never ascribed to her. The right kept saying, hey, we're not saying that, we're not ascribing this to Elizabeth Warren. She obviously didn't command this. Can you give us the same respect and consolation and use, if we were to use this tactic against you, we would be saying, oh yeah, obviously Elizabeth Warren murdered all those people in Dayton, just like you guys are saying that Trump murdered all those people in El Paso. But we didn't do that. And that's why I think that this is perfectly fine on this New York Times front. This is a much lighter way of using their tactics against them, because there's certainly much more heated issues that we could do that for. And I think that teaching them a lesson this way is a lot better than teaching them a lesson on a mass shooter. I just don't think that's appropriate.
I think that
it's almost the exact same thing, though.
I think that since it's the right thing to do to not use this tactic, then anyone who hasn't used it, I wouldn't use it against them. But if someone is using it, then you should be using it back at them, at least for no other reason than to teach them to stop doing that immoral thing, right? That immoral tactic. Yep. They've removed. They've made it okay for that standard to be used against them, because they've said that is the standard that they're going to hold other people to. So okay, we'll hold you to that. But then if someone who has, if it's a news organization that hasn't done it before, right? Then I wouldn't say, okay, well, they never applied that standard to anyone else, so they're not going to apply it to them either, right?
Yep.
Can't think of an example right now.
Well, I think
Daily
maybe
Wire?
It's us. Maybe it's us. Maybe we're the only news media organization that hasn't done that yet.
Possibly. Anyways, moving on with the story.
All right. So there actually is a big difference between what the New York Times publishing opposition research on Trump compared to the conservatives publishing opposition research on the New York Times journalists. When the super woke New York Times published multiple stories about Trump-Russian collusion, they did so dishonestly without any evidence. However, these reports about what their own journalists have said actually really happened. That's why there's screenshots of it. The difference is accuracy, and I'll also add evidence.
Yes. So, there's a big difference between what they're doing, what they did to Trump, and continue to do to Trump, right? Claiming, all this false things about him, and what Trump's supporters are doing to them, taking what they've actually said, the bigoted things they've done. I don't want to minimize this so much. You can't get mad at us for pointing out that you said or did something bigoted. That's actually all on you. There's a huge difference there. The New York Times shouldn't even be trying to use the title of journalist as a defense in the first place, as it has recently come to light that they aren't journalists at all.
That is
true.
The
Times leadership was caught on audio recording admitting that they had failed in their efforts to get rid of Trump using the Russian collusion narrative, so that they were going to instead shift their focus towards painting Trump and his supporters as racist. This recording showed that the rabidly anti-Trump bias at the New York Times wasn't the result of just a few biased journalists or editors. In fact, the New York Times, from the top down, has and plans to continue to coordinate efforts to be politically to put political tribalism before actually reporting the news. Thus, they are propagandists, not journalists.
Well, and I actually, I thought you were going somewhere else with that, but I'll just add where I thought you were going with that was, and I didn't know about this this recording until you just read that. But the other thing is that Washington Post very recently set the precedent that they are not journalists. They set that precedent in court against Nick Sandmann, that they are not in fact a journalism company. I'm not sure what they are, but they did decide that they are legally not considered journalists, which is absolutely hilarious. But they've now set the precedent that anybody who acts and conducts themselves in the manner that the Washington Post does, they are also in theory not journalists.
Right.
So we'll see if the New York Times ever gets tested that in court, but I think the precedent is set.
Yeah, so the Post had reported on what Sandman had done and said that all the lies about him approaching and his group surrounding the Native American man, and they published all these lies and that they had been acted racistly and all the things that they said that they had chanted out that he didn't really chant out, and they attributed it to the Indian guy, right? As being the source, right?
Yep.
And it was ruled in court that they were just repeating, putting to paper what that guy had said, and it wasn't actually their reporting. So they're not journalists. They just take what the people say and repeat it. No critical thought, no actual investigation. You just take what people say and uncritically put it to print. You're not journalists.
Which we'll actually be getting into a very similar incident that the New York Times did the exact same thing that we'll be talking about tomorrow. So a little teaser for you there. But it's also a story that deals with, shocker, racism. And the New York Times just very, very uncritically retyped everything that the racism extremists were saying. And essentially the way they put it down, they didn't even quote the stuff. They were just typing it out as part of the article. So in my opinion, that seems to be that they are reporting as news the things that the activists, extremists are saying as factual news. And they're not uncritically saying, hey, yeah, and they're quote saying this, but here's the reality of the situation. They did the exact same thing with Sandman, where instead of saying, the Indian guy said this, but the reality is that we don't really know, or this video shows it a different way. They just said, oh, yeah, well, we're just going to repeat exactly what he said and not quote it, and so that's now the news.
Yeah, and the amazing and terrible precedent set by that court case was that apparently if you were a news agency, or at least you claim to be one, all you have to do is say, someone, according to this person, and then you can write any defamatory statement you want. You can lie about anyone. You can call Jake Tapper a pedophile and say all this fake evidence you have, like, oh well, we have like 5 statements from people saying they literally saw him raping a kid. He's definitely a pedophile. You can say all those lies about him that are damaging to his reputation, that could get him fired, could affect his family and relationships. You could say all that, and it's not defamation because you said it came from somebody else. That's not how that fucking works.
I remember back when I was a little kid, a million years ago. Nah, it was like a couple of years ago. But you little kids, you go up and tell somebody something. You make a promise to them or tell them a secret, but then you cross your fingers behind your back, and that just means that you don't really mean it. It's kind of the exact same thing. The news media has just been, crossing their fingers, pretending to tell you the truth, but they're really crossing their fingers behind their back. And when you call them on the fact that you're bullcrapping you, they're like, oh, well, I had my fingers crossed, so I didn't really mean it. So I'm not responsible for what I said.
Right. So I'm just going to start quoting other people when they lie about someone, and then that's totally fine. I'm totally in the clear to defame people because someone else said it first. No, you're still defaming them.
Well,
You reported it as fact with no evidence.
Well, Dyer, I anonymous sources are saying that some people are saying that Jake Tapper fucks kids. So,
So, well, if someone said it somewhere, then it must be true. We must be reporting. Our story on Saturday will be about Jake Tapper and the many kids he's apparently raped.
And
it's just tough.
As you guys just saw, Dyer and I just demonstrated what I believe is called a cytogenesis, where Dyer made up something, I cited it, and then he cited me, and now we're going to write an article about it.
We could work for the Washington Post.
No, they don't work nearly that hard.
Okay. Any case, move on to the next part.
A comparison of opinion polls on the New York Times show that people increasingly distrust the New York Times and views them as anti-Trump. I also view them as anti-Semitic.
Yep.
How did the New York Times respond to this? They blamed their readers. They published an article titled "Biased News Media or Biased Readers: An Experiment on Trust." Really?
Yes, they did.
In which they made the argument that the media isn't biased. No, you're just biased for thinking so. They claimed their research shows that the more biased you think the media is, the more biased you are. So wait a second. So basically, are they just saying no? You is that what that is?
Yes, their
No,
answer to clear evidence of their bias is say no. If you think we're biased off of that clear evidence, it just means you're biased. Talk about they must not own any mirrors at the New York Times, and none of the homes of anyone who works there. They must have 0 mirrors. God damn.
I think their article would have been much better summed up by just putting this up there, just a big picture of a reverse Uno card. They're like, oh, you think we're racist? No, reverse. You're the racist. You think we're biased? You're the biased.
Use the same logic against them. A Klansman who advocates racism, right? Is anti-black. Goes up to one of these New York Times journalists, and the New York Times journalist says, "You're a racist," and he says, "No, you're just a racist for thinking I'm a racist." But you're a Klansman. No, you're biased for thinking I have a bias based on all of the evidence of me wearing this white hood and having said racist things.
So
all that evidence, if it makes you think that I'm racist, it only means that you're racist.
So this is a result of the just flood of underachieving millennials getting journalism degrees, and the best of that underperforming crowd somehow landing a job at the New York Times. And this is now the paper of record. Now the best they can come up with is, "I know you are, but what am I?"
Right?
That's the clearest impact of having this just flood of millennials into their ranks.
This is clear evidence that they have no argument. If your argument is if you only think that we're biased because you're biased, they have no defense for the clear idiocy that they produce, right? The New York Times is dead, and I wish I could tell you that this is a recent article that this no, it's you article isn't even the dumbest thing they've printed this week. It's pretty.
I wish it was, because they've printed some pretty dumb shit this week.
Yeah.
and I wish somebody would Epstein me after reading it.
There has been some new developments in the Epstein case.
Oh, is there? Tell me more.
Yeah. So they found from the people who were observing him for the week leading up to his abstaining.
Observing him up until 3 hours before.
Yeah, I mean, including the guy who was actually suffocating him.
Well,
right?
also including the 2 cameras.
All right. So the people who were observing him up to the point where he committed suicide, they they say that he actually had a print version of the New York Times that he was reading on a regular basis, and they found one on his bunk. So with that new evidence, I completely believe he killed himself.
Wait, are you telling me that they gave somebody who used to be on suicide watch a copy of the New York Times? That is not healthy. That's just begging for him to off himself. I do though. After having read the New York Times myself for a week, I now believe that if that's true, I think he killed himself because I don't think I could. I thought we had standards for cruel and unusual punishment in this country.
Yeah, I think this was less of a suicide and just execution by New York Times articles.
This is obviously a satire piece.
See, New York Times journalists that may be reviewing this later. This is what we call having a sense of humor. You might want to get one.
They have them at the Sense of Humor store. It's next to the headlight fluid.
Yeah. Also, dire from 10 years from now when someone's using this to attack you. Hey, buddy.
Sup.
Sup.
Actually, I do. One of the real updates of the Epstein story is that it was not just one camera that was out, but it was actually 2 cameras that was out. And then here's the joke though, is because there was also 2 guards that were supposed to be watching him, and one of them was not a regular guard, and they both fell asleep. I'm wondering if both the cameras fell asleep, and if one was not a regular camera.
Actually, it's a camera that usually works for the corrections, but not normally working in cells. Yeah. Actually, didn't work at all. But
they came up with a really thin story for why these 2 guards were not watching him at the time, and then when it came to the cameras, they're just like, yeah, they just weren't working. We don't even have a good story for it.
Yeah, I thought they fell asleep. Yeah. Wasn't that their story? Their camera story?
They went in sleep mode.
I meant the people.
That's what I did too.
One of them was not a guard. He was like they characterized him as being an employee of the detention facility, which is like, what does that mean? He's a freaking janitor?
Yeah, I know.
And then they said the other guard, the actual guard, was brand new and not fully trained. So wait, do you need training to know not to fall asleep and not, and not leave the guard alone? I thought that was kind of the obvious. Not leave the prisoner alone.
Well, this was New York City, so maybe those 2 guards went through New York City public school system, which we have a story on tomorrow, and we'll find out why. Maybe they were ill prepared to do basic logicking. Yeah,
that would make a lot of sense. So, any closing shots in this story?
The New York Times sucks. I'm a little worn out on just the ridiculous amount of bullshit that they've got going on. They are really, really overdoing it right now. They've got this their 1619 project they're doing that is just bathing in race baiting. They are pushing out just the most toxic stuff for race relations. They're really driving that right now. They've run just as fast as they could for the last 3 years with the Trump-Russia narrative. And they've been right alongside all the rest of the left-wing media when they're going after conservative voices. And as soon as the tables just get a teeny bit turned on them, they panic, freak out, start lashing out at their own readers, which is absurd. And it's actually kind of hilarious because their reaction to it forced, as we went through a little bit ago, it forced some of their peers in the industry to take a look at them and say, "Hey, you guys need to calm down. They're just doing the exact same thing you guys are doing." So again, just the toxic trash that they're putting out, the fake news that they're putting out, and then the absolute hypocrisy of everybody on their staff. It is it's really tragic. That again, the paper of record, the gray lady, that this is what it's become. They've really let themselves go.
Yeah, it's really disappointing because the New York Times, though they were never without bias, were once a great newspaper that actually produced news, right? But they got embroiled with this regressive politics, and they forced out good journalists. And as they became more biased in their reporting, they have dropped in in their sales. Their income has dropped, also along with the loss of print media in general. I think that a lot of it has to do with people not buying newspapers anymore, not physical ones, and so they lost a lot of revenue, and they started moving towards hiring really cheap, really dumb young journalists who were coming in because of the university system very, very much indoctrinated into social justice and intersectionality, right? So not only was it their already inherent bias, it is from the top down that the experienced leaders in the organization are biased, but they're also bringing in people who have that bias, but also are terrible at their jobs because they're cheap. They're new and they're cheap. They're not good at the job, and so they're producing crap. They're not only just producing ideologically biased stuff, but they're producing stuff with a bias that also is really poorly thought out. You could be someone who believes in intersectionality and a regressive leftist and still not produce shit like saying the tactic you use when used against you is bad and not realize what you just said. Right? You could at least be a little introspective and see whether your argument is cogent or not. You'd be able to see how it's just retarded to say, "Oh, if you are criticizing us for being being biased, it must mean you're biased." If there was someone with like two brain cells to rub together, they'd be able to realize that is the dumbest argument you could possibly make in defense of yourself.
So no one at the New York Times.
Right. Well, I mean, they don't pay them enough or recruit people from the right areas to find people who have more than two brain cells.
Well, they are. We'll see if this clickbait strategy will take them into the future. I think a lot of this has to do with very short-term outlooks. Obviously, the internet was a pretty disruptive force for a newspaper company that was that old, but they did not handle the transition gracefully. Certainly not. And
other companies have done far better.
Yes. Going back to kind of the closing shots on it, they used to be the paper of record. They still claim to be the paper of record, but I wish I don't think I've ever really seen one in my lifetime. But I miss the idea of having a news source that is unbiased. We've got left-wing biased newspapers, and we've got right-wing biased, media sources, left-wing media sources and right-wing media sources, and the typical recommendation, if you want to be a well-balanced news diet, is read both. Read the left bias, read the right bias. Well, I do that, but I would like to read the unbiased instead of just guessing at the average. So that I wish that they were what they used to be. As funny as it is what's happening, it's kind of sad for society. It's sad for the republic at large that this is what they've become.
So no reporting is truly without bias. No reporter, rather. There can be a single report that they do that was without bias, right? But no reporter is without bias, and it sometimes seeps into their work. But at least back a long time ago, they tried, right? But now they don't care. Their goal, as said by the New York Times leadership, their goal was for political outcomes. It wasn't to report the news. Whereas other organizations, the primary goal of our organization is to report what actually happened. We give our opinions, and our show is an opinion show, but we also have a website that has articles on it, and those articles are divided by tabs of news and opinion. Because our news articles are exactly what happened and no opinion about it. And then our opinion pieces, which are usually stuff we discussed on the show, are our opinions about the news, right? But we're very clear about that.
Yes.
But they try to pass off of, this is what happened, but they mix in their opinions and pretend like that's just what happened, right? And not their biased view of it. I accept that we have biased views, our own opinions about things, but that's we're telling you our opinions. That's why you come to the show. You want to hear our opinions about the news. But yeah, they're not even trying. Also, thank you very much, CC, for saying that if you were a reporter, you'd report how Dyer is awesim. I'm glad you think that.
That sounds like a pretty biased report. I don't know about that.
It is biased there. You know what? Keep in mind, no person that you watch, that's a public figure or produces content online, don't get an inflated view of how great they are. Keep in mind that you're only seeing a fraction of their life, and everyone is flawed, deeply flawed usually, and everyone has their own demons, their own battles. Don't try to build someone up to being more than human, because then you're just going to disappoint yourself. I'm an average guy. I'm not amazing. I'm just a normal guy, just like you. My opinion is no more important than anyone who watches this. My opinion has no more value than yours, other than the accuracy of my arguments. Right? What makes my ideas good is how true they are, how effective they are. What makes my arguments good is how cogent and accurate they are, not because of who I am. I'm just a person like you. So I'm not amazing. I'm just a dude. It's about the ideas. It's about the truth. It's about what actually happened in the news. It's not about the person reporting it.
I'm pretty awesome, but I digress. I agree with everything Dyer said, and that's actually that's one of the that's kind of one of the key problems that we've got kind of in the modern era. Is we've got a lot of cult of personalities. Certainly here on YouTube and the digital media space, there's a lot of people who really religiously follow certain people. There's a lot of people that do the same things with certain New York Times writers, all definitely with different personalities on mainstream media, mainstream news. You've got a lot of people like really religiously follow Tucker, but you also have just as many people really religiously following Rachel Maddow, and those are the people that they believe it because it's the person, not because of the idea. And they're not looking for the logic. They're looking for that person to just tell them what to think, and that's what they want to follow. And so, for me, an example of how I try not to do that is I very much like Tim Pool's content, but as much as I like Tim Pool's content, even more, I love when I disagree with him and ripping on him, telling him that he's stupid because of something I disagree about him. So I like having that kind of balance where it's like, okay, I like coming to you because I like what you got to say. I typically like your opinion, but I also, when you got something wrong, I'm going to call you out on it. I had the same thing with Dyer. I've got there's a few times over the last year where, I enjoy his opinion quite often. Usually agree with it, but I've come up to him and said, hey, I don't think that you're right on that. And so I think that's a big difference with your more typical conservative versus your more typical leftist is getting out of that cult of personality. Have the people that you follow that you like their opinions, but don't take that as gospel. That's one of the big problems that the left has.
Right. And you know what? One of the big things about trying to develop your own ideas and philosophy is to surround yourself with good people who are critical thinkers, right? People who will call you out when you're wrong, who will help refine your ideas. That's why I value people like Foxlot so much, who will not just you're definitely not a yes man, right? You think for yourself. You think critically about ideas, and I know that you will give me the no bullshit evaluation of what I bring to you, and that's why I bring ideas to you, and that's why I like discussing them with you. And other people in my life, I look for with those attributes. Also, we're telling the audience right now, which mostly is made up of conservatives, centrists, and some more central liberals, right? This group of people that watch our show generally are the people who already watch both left-wing and right-wing sources, because polls have shown that people on the right, they watch left-wing sources. They are aware of the other arguments. But people on the far left and the mid-left, they're almost entirely just watching left-wing sources. So they don't get those lies from the New York Times or CNN or Washington Post. They never see the counter arguments, and that's why they get stuck in those echo chambers. So I think we have the best audience possible.
We love you guys. Hope you
Love
guys
you
love
guys.
us.
Yeah. Fox a lot. That's wow. I'm sorry. Fox Trivies. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry for that. Fox Trivies. How are you feeling card wise? And do you want to do a game stream for a couple rounds?
Let's do games. Let the games begin.
All right. So we're gonna bring this show to an end, but we're gonna be right back with some games. We're gonna do some trivia murder party.
Ooh,
Some people are gonna
sounds
die
fun.
live on stream. Can you handle the tension? Can you?
I want to steal Dyer's body again.
I'll steal it back and I'll win. So if you are able to handle the sheer terror of being killed by Schmitty, please join us in about less than 10 minutes. All right. See you guys soon. Adios. Dire Wolf out.
Fox out. How do I turn this thing off?
I don't know.
And